Well, hello everybody. This is Don Stacy's YouTube channel. I've decided I'm going to begin reading stories from my science fiction collection titled Tales of the Bizarre and Unnatural. I've done this before a few times, but this will be sequential from the first to the last. So let's get this underway. All right, Tales of the Bizarre and Unnatural. And we'll start off with the first story, Trip Out of Town. For the past 2 weeks, Darren Blair remained in his apartment. Not, as you might think, because he was suffering from a bout of flu or some other illness. Man in his early 40s, Blair was in perfect health. Physically, he had thick brown hair which his barber trimmed back once a month. He performed a round of exercises after he arose from bed each morning and had given himself a shave. He stood an inch or so above average height and had inherited a well-shaped chin, nose, and brow from his parents, whose forebears could be traced back to the British Isles. During his 20s, Blair had sometimes toyed with the idea of moving to Hollywood, tending bar and trying his hand at acting. But common sense always prevailed, and he eventually got a degree in structural engineering and landed his first and only job as an estimator for a large construction company, a company which, just 5 months ago, fell into bankruptcy and left Blair quite unemployed. Immediately following this calamity, Blair strove with assiduous effort to find a new position. He sent out a flurry of resumes, telephoned even the most tentative of his contacts in the construction industry, scoured the trade journals for job announcements, placed his application whenever and wherever he was invited to do so, all without a single positive, encouraging reply. Gradually, his efforts grew less assiduous, like a cyclist slowing to a crawl up a mountain road which grows steadily steeper. Now he was moribund, utterly discouraged, ashamed. Clearly he knew he had to get up on his feet and do something. He had to get away from his computer and his flat-screen television and go outdoors, if only for the sake of a little fresh air. Moreover, last night he finished off the last of his frozen dinners, and the refrigerator, quite empty, now went through its cooling cycles for nothing. Blair changed from his pajamas and bathrobe into a shirt and trousers, slid his stocking feet into a pair of leather shoes whose comfortable fit felt like the return of an old friend. He went into the bathroom, urinated, and ran a comb through his hair a few times while giving himself a terse look of approval. Then he grabbed his coat and swept up the car keys from the top of a bookcase and went out. As usual, the thoroughfares were teeming with traffic, which slowed abruptly as drivers turned in and were out of shopping malls and gas stations. Blair, tense and ever alert behind the steering wheel, always drove at a conservative distance from the vehicle in front of him and held nothing but contempt for tailgaters. There were far too many aggressive drivers, in his opinion, all of them fools in a hurry. Presently he turned into a strip mall which included a supermarket, a discount clothing store, and a UPS outlet. He pulled into a parking space near the edge of the lot and walked toward the front of the supermarket, past an array of potted flowers and stacked bales of peat moss, and passed through the automated sliding glass door. But as the doors hissed shut behind his back, he took a few staggering steps and came to a halt, stunned and powerless to comprehend the scene of absolute wreckage before him. Every shelf in the store had been ransacked, the aisles littered with debris, the fluorescent lights above enveloped in snaking spirals of electricity. Blair felt a blind panic seize hold of him, and he was about to flee outside when he suddenly remembered that he had nothing to eat, quite literally nothing to eat in his apartment. Feverishly he glanced all about. He concluded that the looters, if indeed an angry mob of looters had caused this mayhem, had departed. He saw no one. Propelled forward by the specter of unabated hunger, Blair grabbed a handbasket laying on its side on the floor and proceeded further into the store. Well, what's going on, you ask? You'll soon find out. So this is present day. He had to step carefully over the muck of mashed fruits and vegetables, having already grabbed up a sack. Of potatoes, as he ventured toward the meat department. Once there, he found little that remained. Most of the packages still there appeared to have been ripped open and contaminated. He took the one remaining whole chicken, its sturdy plastic bag still intact, along with a hefty pork roast, the wrapping around it still secure, and then hurried toward the aisle where cans of coffee had always been shelved. This aisle was strewn with broken bags of coffee beans and burst open packages of pasta. Blair slid his feet carefully through the debris toward the section of shelving reserved for canned ground coffee. Relieved to see a few cans left, he pulled one from the back of the shelf and slid it into his basket. In the last aisle he visited, laid waste like all the others, he thankfully found a few sacks of beans and rice. And these he added to the growing heavy heap in his basket, which he now lugged with both hands to the front of the store. He walked up to the automated glass doors, expecting them to open immediately, but they remained shut. Blair felt a wave of desperation crash over him as he dropped the basket to the floor and lunged at the doors and tried to pry them open with his fingers. He managed to separate the frames by only a fraction of an inch before his strength gave out and he let go with a curse which echoed throughout the silent, ruined supermarket. Then he spun around and tugged the basket up and made a feverish, hurried shuffle toward the back of the store. He went through a pair of swinging metal doors into the receiving and storage area, which appeared far less ransacked. His heart racing with renewed panic, he whipped his head back and forth in search of an exit. In a moment he spotted a door at the far corner of the building and hurried toward it, the heavy basket thumping against his thigh. He burst through a pair of... As he was about to go out, he noticed a small set of keys hanging from a nail driven into a wooden stud next to the door. He grabbed the keys and shoved them into his trouser pocket, and, having made sure the door would lock upon closing, he stepped out onto the loading dock, above which a dark gray sky swarmed with seagulls and crows. By the time Blair reached his car, he was heaving for breath, the muscles in his arms burned with fatigue, and he was drenched in sweat. He opened the back door to the driver's seat and put the basket on the seat. He pushed the door shut with that absent air that arises from physical exhaustion, and leaned back against the car and looked into the middle distance at nothing. Very soon an odd and puzzling sense invaded the fringe of his awareness. There was no traffic noise. He straightened and looked out across the parking lot at the main avenue. Nothing moved. Cars and trucks lined the avenue as if frozen in place, as though the engine in every vehicle had undergone a simultaneous malfunction. Blair jumped into his car and jammed the key into the ignition, giving a hard twist. Nothing happened. not a sound. What was going on? Was he going out of his mind? He got out of the car and looked all around with a wary, nervous glance. Here and there he noticed someone on foot or riding a bicycle. Some technological meltdown, he thought. Maybe a solar burst of high-frequency energy had caused all this. Whatever the reason, Blair was beginning to understand that life had been altered, perhaps irreversibly, by some sudden cataclysm. The laws of civilized behavior would dissolve, disappear, governments would collapse under the forces of anarchy. With all the guns in the United States, a great bloodletting would ensue. He stepped around to the back of the car and opened the trunk and stared down at a set of golf clubs clustered against a large leather bag and inside a large leather bag, and beside it a collapsible handcart for the bag. A mirthless laugh escaped his throat. He'd taken up golf not long after he'd been hired by the construction firm. He'd been a terrible yet persistent player, never quite able to get the hang of it. First he lifted out the handcart and pried the third wheel and upper shaft into position, then gradually withdrawing the bag from the trunk, allowed all the clubs to spill out. He stuffed the bag through the steel hoops of the cart, then returned to the trunk and fished out the iron and slipped it back into the golf bag. Finally, he retrieved the handbasket from the back of the seat and transferred its contents into the golf bag. After shutting the trunk and locking the car, he pulled the cart into motion behind him and set off for his apartment. About every 20 minutes, Blair, shaken from all that he had seen along the way, arrived at his home, having lugged the handcart up 2 flights of stairs. He dropped onto the sofa and leaned forward and stared at the floor, feeling as though he were about to weep. Along the way, he once had to fend off a lone teenage marauder who hung back as Blair swung the iron in a series of vicious arcs. Finally discouraged, the young man burst out with a contemptuous laugh and went away. As Blair continued on, occasionally he saw people wandering back and forth across the avenue between the motionless vehicles. Most of them seemed to be in shock, incapable of any purposeful action. But many of those who occasionally trudged past Blair looked steely-eyed as they carried their looted burdens. The worst part of his brief journey occurred just after he'd passed through the entrance to the apartment complex in which he lived. In front of one of the buildings, on a narrow expanse of freshly mown lawn, lay a woman sobbing, her face bloodied, and between her splayed legs a man rose up to his knees, pulling a pair of jeans back around his waist. The man then leered at Blair as he touched an extended index finger to his lips. Horrified, Blair looked away quickly and hurried past, although a moment later he stopped and turned around. The man had already disappeared, but the woman remained on the ground, an arm flung across her eyes. Blair, dragging the handcart, hurried back toward her. He left the cart next to the curbing and went to her and knelt beside her head. "Is there any way that I can help you?" he asked gently. Her arm moved away from her eyes, one of them already beginning to swell. In a kind of hopeless, tearful rage, she cried, "Go away, just go away." Once more stung by the cruelty of that scene and the woman's raging despair, Blair sprang up from the sofa and began to pace about. Then he lunged at the handcart containing the golf bag and in a wild fury threw it to the floor, the pork roast rolling out on top of the bag. Rolling out of the top of the bag. Everything had changed. The world had gone completely insane in less than a day. He began to bellow and roar in rage and helpless fury. Then, spent at last, tears dripping from his eyes, he dropped to the floor and slowly pounded the carpet with his fist. Electricity now only flowed from batteries. Water, at least for the time being, continued to pour when you turned a faucet. But once the municipal tanks emptied out, running water would also be at an end. A few days had passed since Blair had entered the supermarket. Once he had recovered himself and gathered his wits, he started to put the food away in the kitchen, and as he opened the refrigerator door, quickly discovered to his alarm that a power outage had occurred along with everything else. He would have to cook the meat immediately and salt it down to stave off spoilage. Luckily, he had a barbecue grill out on the balcony and nearly a full bag of charcoal briquettes inside the balcony storage closet. He cut the chicken into pieces and sliced the pork roast into steaks and spent a few hours grilling the meat. From time to time, he would glance out across the courtyard to see many of his neighbors doing exactly the same thing. He also had given a good deal of thought to the weeks and months ahead. Life in the city was going to grow increasingly untenable. That was obvious. The looting of the supermarket would quickly exhaust the food supply. Gun owners would doubtless wield their weapons not merely for personal safety, and disposal of the dead could prove to be an intractable problem following the onset of mass starvation. He was driven to a single conclusion by an inexorable God damn it. He was driven to a single conclusion by an inexorable logic. He must leave for the countryside. Yet how many thousands of people would have already come to that same conclusion? He could foresee that the closer outlying farms would soon suffer an invasion of desperate former city dwellers. And the farmers were not about to welcome this encroachment. No, they wouldn't. Farmers like to put up no trespassing signs all over their property. I know, I saw them when I was a boy. And ignored them. Early the following day, Blair went out to the garage assigned to his apartment. He knew the automatic door opener would prove useless, so he squatted down in front of the center of the door and wedged his fingers beneath its bottom frame and pulled upward with all his strength. With a grinding protest, the door rose far enough that Blair could squirm through beneath it. Once inside the garage, he allowed his eyes to adjust to the ill-lit gloom. At first it seemed odd to him that his car was missing, but he brushed that thought aside and stepped up to a mountain bike suspended from a pair of hooks along the wall. He took down the bicycle and set it on the cement floor and squeezed first one tire, then another. He found his bicycle pump laying atop a stack of empty boxes and securing it with his feet next to each tire in turn made sure the air pressure within them was ample. Next, he sorted through his tool chest, removing a set of wrenches and a set of hex keys and a spoke wrench, fitting them all into his coat pockets. He found a little plastic box containing some inner tube patches and a small tube of adhesive and put that in his pocket as well. He paused, thinking, what else should I take? A moment later, he snatched up a few screwdrivers, both flathead and Phillips, and stuffed them into his pockets as well. Then he lifted the entire tray away and stared at the larger tools beneath: hammer, pipe wrench, wood planer, etc. Remnants of the time when he had been married and made the occasional home repair. Fleetingly, he thought of his ex-wife. Then he removed the hammer and set the tray back in place. He rolled the bicycle to the partially open garage door and laid it gently down and shoved it outside. Then he retrieved the pump and the hammer and with a little underhand toss pitched them out beneath the door, one at a time. Getting down on his stomach once again, he inched himself back outside and then scrambled up to his feet and looked around. Much to his relief, no one was about. He gathered up both pump and hammer, picked up the bicycle with his other hand, and rolled it toward the stairway. Later that night, Blair was sleeping fitfully when the sound of 3 gunshots fired in rapid succession brought him wide awake, and he sat up, his heart racing, listening for whatever other sounds he could hear. For the time being, no further shots were fired, but Blair's imagination reeled with scenes of wanton, unaccountable savagery. Unable to sleep, he got out of bed, slipped on his bathrobe, and went into the kitchen and peered out through the window down at a section of the courtyard, then gazed at an adjacent building and a small stretch of the drive which ran in front of it. From the dim light of a quarter moon, he could make out a shadowy pair of moving figures, but that was all. A moment later, they had disappeared. Under the present conditions, Blair thought, no one, absolutely no one, who was decent-minded and meant no harm to others, would be prowling about at such an hour. As he remained standing at the window, now and again noting how the crescent moon slowly ebbed across the night sky, he gazed at the darkened windows across the courtyard, and he wondered about the people behind those windows. How many days before they all begin to turn on each other, he wondered. Then he thought, hasn't it already begun? Well, the story is getting a little more spooky. That's what science fiction writers do, especially dystopian novelists and short story writers. They invite a nightmare so that they can experience this nightmare in a conscious manner and write it down, basically transcribe it. And that's what I did. Kafka, Franz Kafka, he did something similar, although his style was with occasional sprinkles of humor. It was very objective. And in his journal, he once said that, or wrote, that something to the effect that he would take an axe to the frozen sea of his consciousness. It's an odd image. Anyway, let's continue. At first light, he took the tools he would need and carried his bicycle down the stairway and set off toward a large sporting goods store. He rode through residential neighborhoods as far as possible to minimize brushing contact with looters or worse. Robins and other birds were awakening, filling the air with the merriment of their early morning calls, indifferent to the oncoming avalanche of human woe below them. Presently, he coasted out onto the main avenue along which he would find the sporting goods store. Feeling little surprise, he saw a number of people wandering along the street past all the stationary cars and along the sidewalks in search of anything they believed would be valuable to them. He quickly turned into a darkened alley and jumped off his bike and secured it to a telephone pole with a cable lock, then continued on foot. When he reached the parking lot in front of the sporting goods store, he braced himself for what was to come. The glass panels of the entrance doors had been smashed, shards of glass covering the ground. A moment later, he was inside. A number of people were milling silently about in the dimness, all hoping to find something useful. As he made his way toward the camping equipment, he passed a crowd of men along with several women, all jostling nearly shoulder to shoulder in the gun department. High overhead was a long rack of rifles. Just in front of this, a nimble man perched on a tall stepladder grabbed one gun after another and pitched them down to the grimly appreciative recipients, their arms all extended and competing to make the next catch. Blair had considered grabbing a pistol, but he knew nothing about guns and would not have known which caliber of ammunition to take along with it. Now, looking about among the camping equipment, he removed a small flashlight from his coat pocket and scoured the shelves for a box which corresponded to the hemispherical pup tent set up on display nearby. Soon spotting one small enough to clench under his arm, he continued his search and found a shattered display case with a few remaining hunting knives. The cabinet beneath the case was locked, so Blair took one of the unsheathed knives and pried it open. Inside, as he had hoped, were stacks of narrow boxes containing knives of various sizes, each inserted into a companion leather sheath. He removed one of the larger boxes, took out the sheathed knife, and slipped it down his backside beneath his belt. He hurried on to one other section of the store where the bicycles were ordinarily kept on display. Now only a few remained, but Blair had not come for a bicycle. He wanted to find a trailer. Anxiously he glanced about, while in the background those in the gun department had become increasingly agitated, now shouting and quarreling among themselves. At last he spotted a trailer and had been partially hidden beneath some overturned shelving. Blair flung aside the empty shelving and pulled the compact single-wheeled trailer out over the spilled debris. He was about to hurry out of the store when the thought of spare parts flashed through his mind, leaving the trailer in the middle of the nearly empty display floor. He hurried back behind the service counter and found boxes containing spare inner tubes, sets of spokes, wheel bearings, crankcase bearings, etc. He grabbed a packet of spokes and a few boxes of inner tubes, including one for the trailer's small wheel, stuffed them into a plastic bag, and scrambled back to the trailer, which was now being eyeballed by a man in his late 20s, standing just a few feet away. As Blair unzipped the trailer's square-shaped red nylon bag and placed the sack in the box pup tent, which he'd had pressed beneath his arm all this time inside it, the man said, "Looks like you plan to do some traveling." Blair glanced nervously up at him, then rose and said, "That's right. In a few weeks there won't be much left around here." "More like a few days. I wish I could leave, but I can't, not with my wife and kids." "They're young, aren't they, your kids?" Blair asked, not unsympathetic. "Yeah, 3 and 5. I don't know what we're going to do. But at least now I have this," he said, pulling a handgun from his coat pocket. He merely stood there and studied the gun with a forlorn gaze. Tension twisted up inside Blair, and he said carefully, "Well, I need to be going." He took hold of the front of the trailer's frame, which would be attached to his bicycle, and he edged past the man, who slowly returned the gun to his pocket. "Good luck, man," he said quietly. Blair wished him the same. In the alley, he worked quickly to fasten the trailer frame to the bicycle's rear axle. As soon as was done, he straddled the bicycle and coasted experimentally from the alley onto the side street, getting accustomed to the extra weight and drag. He went back the way he had come, through residential areas. By now there was full daylight, and as he passed along the silent streets and the large, attractive homes with their lush green lawns, he sometimes had to veer around a stalled car or pickup truck. On one occasion, he swung around a UPS truck and could hear someone in the back slicing open a cardboard box with a knife. Now and again, he would see a man with a backpack, probably